There it is. Welcome, everybody, to the National Creativity Network webinar series. My name is George Sigos, and I'm the chair of the National Creativity Network, and will be your webinar host, along with my fellow board member, Wendy Lisco. The National Creativity Network is dedicated to fostering imagination and creativity so North America can remain a leader in innovation, free enterprise, and democratic values. We believe the very future of our communities and institutions depends on our ability to nurture imagination and to effectively tap creativity to solve existing problems and to generate new opportunities. The National Creativity Network was created to enhance the flow of ideas, information, and practices across disciplines, and especially among key centers of creativity that cross education, commerce, culture, and government. We want to improve the ease with which these centers of creativity can gain access to the best thinking, best questions, and most successful ways of working together. The monthly webinar series is one of our strategies to connect people across North America. We alternate between subjects of interest identified by our membership and open mic sessions where the NCN community can share what they're working on and learn from each other's successes and challenges. So please mark the third Thursday of every month in your calendar for a guaranteed stimulating conversation around the most pressing issues in the creativity movement. And please let us know if you would like a particular topic discussed or if you want an open mic slot in the future. So now on to today's presentation. We're thrilled to have Robert Kelley from the University of Calgary with us today to explore ways to bring creativity into mainstream educational practice. Educator and artist Robert Kelley is an associate professor in both the Arts and Education departments at the University of Calgary in Western Canada. His pioneering work in the area of creativity includes the design and coordination of the university's Creativity in Educational Practice graduate program. During today's webinar, he will explore the how of learning and teaching creatively and share some of his research from his recently published book, Educating for Creativity, A Global Conversation. This new book is the second installment of a three-part creativity tome that will conclude with a practical how-to guide to educating for creativity, scheduled for release in March of 2014. Robert has been a featured keynote speaker nationally and internationally, and he's also participated in NCN programs in the past, including during the America's Imagination Summit in New York. So we're thrilled to have Robert Kelley with us today. And Robert, the floor is yours.
Hey, thanks very much. Thanks, Wendy. Welcome, everybody. Wendy, you'll be looking after these images. Hey, let's cut to the chase right now. What does creativity look like in educational practice? I'm going to go back a couple of years to when I was doing a presentation at a university in Western Canada on creativity as a primary rationale for education. And my brother, the principal, who was a principal of a K-8 school in the city where I was speaking, was in the audience. He was the first one to get off the stage, to meet me when I got off the stage, and the first thing he said to me, he said, "That's all very nice. I mean, this creativity thing." He said, "But what will it look like? What will I be doing? What will my staff be doing?" So until you answer those questions, it really doesn't mean anything. Now, we've seen in the last several years, creativity has made its way into the mainstream of educational conversation. It's been adopted by national, state, provincial jurisdictions as being central to 21st century learning. So we have a lot of people all dressed up and they need a place to go. That was the impetus for the latest volume, Educating for Creativity, A Global Conversation. What I attempted to do with that volume was I recruited educators from all around the world, from early childhood to post-secondary, where creativity was central to their educational practice. So I wanted teachers writing for teachers, educators for educators and parents. So we have examples from India, Riverside School in India. We have Denmark, the UK, all the way to North America, Canada, and the U.S. So plus I fronted with some of my own theoretical construct. So when if you move to the next slide, please. My image. Now, this is a painting of mine, a little bit about myself. I'm in a faculty of arts, in arts education, and I'm an adjunct in the faculty of education where I run this graduate program called Creativity in Educational Practice. It's part of an interdisciplinary MEd degree, and it's going into its second cohort. Now, because I work as an artist, I want to make one thing clear right now. I'm talking about creativity across the discipline spectrum. I'm not talking about purely an arts-based thing or this is an arts-only thing. I'm talking about creativity across the discipline spectrum. I've happened to develop my creative explorations and stuff through artistic exploration and development of books and that. And hey, and get a load of this. I got an email from the head of the chemistry department at my university yesterday. He's upset with the lack of creativity amongst the undergraduate chemistry students. He wants to meet with me to discuss enhancing creative practice amongst undergraduate chemistry students. Now, that'll be an interesting conversation. The only way that we can come together is that we share a commonality in vocabulary and an understanding of creative process. And that's sort of the main starting point. Now, let's move to, Wendy, can we move to the creative development graphic? Next one after that. Next one. There we go. Now, here's the question. Very first thing we have to understand is this. If we're going to bring creativity into educational practice, we need a common vocabulary and an understanding of what creative development is. Okay? And what I've tried to do, this is the first part of the book, of the new book, is sort of put this in plain language in a way that educators and parents, most educators and parents can understand. Hey, I taught junior high school and high school for years before I entered academia, and I'm also trained as an elementary teacher. So I understand the nuances of being right in the trenches or right on the shop floor where this has to work. So this is a construct that I made to articulate in a graphic way what I think creative development is. And it's a framework. It's a framework that I think is very useful to help us frame this. Now, here's the first thing that has to happen. First of all, definition for creativity. Hey, I use a general definition. I use Jane Peerdo or Todd Lubart to make something new or novel. Okay? It goes from the thought, the imagination realm, into making something new or novel. Okay? And we can discuss that further later. And hey, I look forward to your questions when we finish here in about 20 minutes or so. This will be interesting with the diverse audience that we have. So, and I agree with Mark Runco in California that when you use the word creativity, you should contextualize it. Put some kind of qualifying term in front of it to locate where it is. If we have a common, at least a framework to work off of, it makes it much easier to implement this systematically in an intelligent way into educational practice. So let me explain this construct briefly, and then I'm going to go back and forth to some other graphics. First of all, look at the very bottom of this. Are we all creative? Okay, ask yourself, are we all creative? If we're all creative, then why do we need this in the first place? Why do we need creativity in education if we're all creative? And why do we need creativity? Well, I think the obvious answer there is, what's the sense of having students, learners, consume data endlessly without giving them a disposition to enable them to apply it in innovative and wondrous ways for the benefit of other people, the economy, any number of things. Are we all creative? I think we're adaptive species. We're definitely, you look at small c creativity, for example. Intuitive adaptive creativity is the term I would use for describing our species, that we intuitively adapt to situations. Look at a preschooler. Look at somebody, a young baby attempting to crawl and deal with constraints. Hey, lying. Lying is an example I often use in my talks, that even little kids lie. Have you lied? Have all of you out there lied before? If you haven't lied before, I'd like you to chime in and type me a message. I'd be curious to meet you. But that's a very spontaneous kind of creative act. So we have this adaptive nature about ourselves. It's how we've survived, how we get through the day, cooking, dressing, our daily living. We're an adaptive species. Now the question is, does that get developed? And another question is, what does it get developed into? So to understand that is to understand what I think the way we should frame, or one way of framing creative development for the purpose of applying it into education, into educational practice. So if you look at this, we start off, we have this basic disposition, and it's either going to be grown or it's going to be diminished, right? Now, what is it going to be grown in? At the very top of that pyramid, I have a term, not a pyramid, but the directionality of this is a term called sustained creativity or sustained creative practice. Now, I would articulate that or explain that as the ability or the capacity to engage in sustained iterations of idea generation and experimentation over time. And that's the key. And that's on the basis of a self-instigated, emotionally and intellectually meaningful creative exploration by the learner. Now, here's a premise I want you to think about and we can discuss during the question period. Here's my fundamental belief. I believe that every learner from early childhood through to adulthood and every educator at all levels, at every level of education and every discipline should be creating original work. Now, I'd be curious to hear your comments on that. I believe that too. So in order to enable that, we have to enable learners to be able to grow their creative capacity. Now, the term creative capacity I would use to describe the level of complexity at which one can engage in creative practice. So as we acquire creative confidence, creative maturity, which I've indicated on this graphic right here, we will increase our creative capacity, which inevitably will result in a greater capacity to engage in sustained creative practice as opposed to our innate, intuitive, adaptive disposition. So I generally frame a creative development that way. Now, what constitutes creative development? Now, if you notice on the schematic, I've got in the circle there, it's got creative development strands. Around those strands there are 7 bubbles that I think, I call them creative development strands. And as an educator, you'd have to be acutely aware of all of these at play to be able to understand whether or not you are nurturing or how to nurture the creative development of a learner. Okay, and I'm going to go into these in detail, but really quickly, collaborative development, which is, I think, the foundation of all of them, self-instigative development, research investigative development, experimentational, generative, analytical, and creative sustained development. Through these 7 strands, we can enable learning environments that are conducive to creative development and creative growth. And you'll notice towards the top of that direction, under sustained creativity, I have 3 branches, sort of, innovative, mature creative practice, inventive, and interpretive. I'll get to that later because there's a few skews. Now, Wendy, if you could go to the schematic that has all the arrows pointing towards the middle idea. It's the one before this. This one right here. In order for you to enable creative development, you have to clearly understand the factors that are limiting a creative culture of an educational culture of creativity. If you are not aware of these things, it's very difficult to develop any inventive momentum within a classroom setting or any educational setting. Now, this schematic is based on my little schematic of an idea. In the middle, there's a circle with a dot around it, right? And this poor idea is sad. It's got nowhere to go. Now, this circle can either expand and radiate out and combine with other circles. Can we go to the idea graphic, Wendy? No, the one with the circles on it. That one right here. So that idea can expand and go out and embrace and intersect other ideas. Or if we go back to the arrow schematic, it can close in on itself and we can close in on itself and not go anywhere. Now, in traditional mainstream educational culture, these are the various forces at play that will limit creative development and any kind of creative possibility. Now, before I go any further, let me contextualize something that's very important. When we talk about creative practice and education, I want to identify 2 general arenas where creative practice will take place, okay? Let's look at learning and teaching creatively, okay? Now, this is what I would expect any teacher or educator worth their salt would be engaged in on a daily basis, and that would be taking mandated state, national, provincial curricula and doing your best to make remote content interesting, to engage students in fun activities and engaging activities. So that's one part of it, and that's where a lot of this energy in creativity and education seems to go. Now, I want to identify another area that I think is often left to happenstance, and we often never get to it because of time constraints, and that's learning to create. And there's a distinction. So learning and teaching creatively and learning to create, I think, are two very different things. Learning to create, I would define as students engaging in self-instigative, creative explorations over time that were emotionally and intellectually relevant to them. Okay? Now, here are some of those back pressure factors that we're all familiar with. Outcomes known. Have you dealt with this before? That students are engaging in a lot of stuff where the outcome is already known. They know they know what the teacher's looking for, or they have an idea. Hey, the story I like to use is my very first month as a teacher in junior high years ago before I got into academia. And the principal told me, he came in the staff room one day and he said, guess what, you're being inspected next week by the superintendent. And I was just a brand new teacher, right? Well, the very first thing that I did was go to my colleagues in the staff room and I asked them, I said, what is the superintendent looking for? In other words, I wanted to know what was on the test. And their thing was pretty simple. He said, he really likes class participation. If you have a lot of class participation, you will get a good review from the superintendent after your first month of teaching. So I thought, oh, that's easy to do. I can do that. So I went to my class before the superintendent came in. It was grade 7 social studies. And I asked them all, I said, look, I'm being inspected. Every time I ask a question, I want all of you to put your hand up. If you know the answer, put your right hand up. If you don't know the answer, put your left hand up. Okay? So I cheated. I had the whole thing fixed. The superintendent came in. I taught the lesson. All the hands went up. I knew who knew the answers and who didn't know the answers, so I'd ask a few wrong ones, a few right ones, and I thought, this is really great. I love teaching. And my report said, great class participation. Anyways, outcomes known, given what they want. Number 2, early closure. Early closure on idea generation. Now, an idea can close in on itself, or it can grow and combine and recombine with other ideas and in several iterations. This is a killer in creative culture. Students have been taught to seek out a right answer, and they haven't been taught to grow, generate, and experiment. They've been socialized into early closure. So often their first idea is their last. And this goes well into our adult population. Extrinsic motivation. We rely purely on the teacher, the educator, supplying the motivating piece for this work, but really we'd like to have intrinsic motivation. Dissociation, I'm going to use this as the last one. I'll leave the rest for you to read. Dissociation is an emotional detachment from the work. If the students don't own the work, they don't have an emotional connection to the work, you can tell right away. It doesn't take an experienced educator very long to walk into a classroom to see a student that's been disengaged. Their body language tells it all. Have you ever been to a party and looked around at all the couples at a party? You can study their body language and just can tell who likes each other and who doesn't. Just look at how they talk to each other, how they stand, how they touch. Well, dissociation is rampant. A lot of the schools, by the way, in the book, Educating for Creativity, the main impetus came about because of student disengagement, especially at the secondary level. What's wrong with this picture? Now, Wendy, if we can move back to the creative development chart, please. Now, so the thing is, so here's a matrix, or here's a graphic to sort of try and explain how do we do this. So let's look at, and how do I get that idea from that idea illustration I showed earlier? How do I get that idea to combine and recombine? How do I create a culture that will enable that? So let's move to the next slide, please. Now, here's the first of the creative development strands that I think are essential for systematically implementing creative development within educational practice. Collaboration. Now, there's a distinction between collaboration and cooperation, okay? Look at Randy Nelson's Pixar stuff if you want to elaborate more on that. This is a tough one. We have a culture that's very competitive, that's very privacy intense, where sharing ideas isn't really the greatest thing. hey, if you look at Charles Leadbeater in the UK, his new stuff, recent stuff, he talked about new generations are defined by what they share, not by what they own. And this is really, really important. Collaboration of these 7 creative development strands, I think, is the foundation for all of it. And this is not going to happen if you aren't aware of those counter skews that limit creative development. Collaboration involves having trust. It involves creating a statusless environment in classrooms and in learning organizations. Environments that are typically hierarchical, right, that have vertical hierarchies. People are not going to come out and volunteer ideas, crazy ideas, if they fear they're going to be judged or whatever. Now, here's what I do to foster a culture of collaboration in a classroom. Number 1, and this is well known amongst the theater community, I use plussing or a yes and. In other words, the rule in the class is really simple. Anytime anybody suggests an idea, the only comment I make to that person is I add to the idea. I grow their idea. I'm not going to cheerlead and go, oh, that's a great idea. I'm not going to be a hitchhiker and say, oh, I love Tommy's idea. I'm going to add the rule of plussing. Okay? I want to establish that culture so that if I give an idea, I know it's not going to be invalidated. It's going to be added to. In other words, I end up with 2 ideas or whatever. So the rule of plussing. The strategy I use for this, one simple one, I use a strategy called speed dating. It's really, really effective. Not brainstorming in a group. I have students talk to each other one-on-one. If I had a class of 20 students, I would make 2 rows of 10 chairs, a foot apart, and I'd have students come with ideas to a project already. You have to have money to come to the table when you're exchanging ideas. Otherwise, a student will acquiesce to the verbally dominant person in the group. Now it's me talking to one person, somebody who I may never have talked with in that class ever, okay? And my goal, when I do this several times throughout major projects. We do it at the beginning to generate ideas, and the goal here with idea generation through collaboration is that quantity is absolutely everything. The more ideas I have, I can exponentially increase the amount of outcomes, possible outcomes, that I can have from my creative exploration. So I'll have 2 rows of 10. They get about 3 minutes, and then we rotate. So I'm talking face-to-face with one other person, and we get to know each other. We plus each other. We grow our idea lists. Remember, we share ideas. We're not going to be private about them. Good artists borrow, great artists steal. So we need to share those ideas freely. And then as we get to meet all the class, after the first round, I know everybody in the class by first name. I know what they're working on, and I've added to their ideas. I continue this throughout a project, and then they get to know each other. And it's an incredible device for flattening out the status in a class. To read about statusless cultures, read John Sweeney, Innovation at the Speed of Laughter. He talks a lot about creating statusless cultures. One of the things, too, to get over is that there's a lot of fear and trepidation when it comes to creating, because people feel vulnerable. They're worried about making mistakes. This is unfortunate. If you create a trusting create a trusting environment of collaboration, it should be pretty kosher. Can we move to the next slide, Wendy, please? Now, this is a really critical and a really tough one for most people. This is another developmental strand. This is called, I would say, self-instigative development. Now, the word provocation is often used here. I prefer the word instigated, where it comes from the student. And really, one of our challenges is, how do we structure educational environments so students become initiators? How do they become self-aware enough to grow creative explorations that have a high level of personal relevance, both emotionally and intellectually, that they will drive. Remember, when you have an emotional connection to something, you will walk through fire to get this done. And that's what you like to see in learners, both emotional and intellectual questions. So developing a self-instigative disposition is difficult, especially when we have a rampant culture of extrinsic motivation and consumption, where students are used to consuming and restating and retelling. And now for this culture, we want them to be self-instigators. One of the key strategies for this is the whole notion that I cited earlier in speed dating, and that is hyper idea generation. I assign masses of idea generation, large numbers for my student through collaboration, and then after that happens, we can start locating interest areas of the student, interest areas they were never aware of when we look at concentrations of ideas and that. So self-instigation is a way of handing off ownership. A lot of teachers are uncomfortable with this because they want to be in control. But you have to look at this as a baton, as a relay race. That for the while the educator carries the baton, you're going to hand it off to the student, and you want them to run with it, but run with it with passion. They won't run with it with passion if they don't own it. So self-instigated would mean generating creative exploration of personal relevance, emotional and intellectual. Next slide. Now, research investigative development. You know what? We've taught everybody to report. I mean, I don't like giving papers to my students in this creativity cohort because I give them a reading and they write a paper back to me and I'll say, look, I've already read the article. What are you telling me this back for? I mean, there's other reasons to do papers. Rather they create original work throughout this cohort. So research is you need discipline competency. You need some nuts and bolts in a discipline. Don't get me wrong. People think creativity, we're going to sit in a room and wait for a psychic breeze. No, that's not the case. We're going to, you want to be investigative. Mature creative producers always have their antennae up, and any stimuli that comes their way is fair game for creative production. Now, what happens with our students, by the way, mature creative producers are self-fuelers. They gather stimuli readily. They look where they never have looked before. We have to co-fuel our students. We have to teach them how to fuel themselves and to go from reporting to investigating. But once a creative journey is set in motion that's relevant to the student, investigation becomes much easier. So this developmental strand would encompass discipline competency, discipline knowledge or discipline base, as well as an investigative disposition. Next slide, please. Now, let's get into the meat of this. At the heart of growing a creative project or creative practice would be generating ideas. Now, when I talk about generating ideas, I'm talking about the thought realm, okay? And ideas the quantity is absolutely everything. Students, when they're on their way to developing a creative exploration, need quantity. They get quantity by research and by exchanging ideas with their colleagues who are a great source of ideas. But generative practice will only go so far in the thought realm or in the imagination realm. It has to be brought, let's go to the next slide, into the experimentational realm. So idea generation and experimentation go hand in glove. They're both generative practices. It goes thought form, okay? If you exist only in thoughts, and I would never accept from a student, by the way, I have a lot of good ideas. I want to see them. Have your students give your ideas form. And then those forms can be shared with other students. Because as soon as they give the idea form, a drawing, a maquette, anything, the ideas can be shared. Now, and some people are great at diverging. So I would say idea generation is a form of divergence, right? Experimentation is as well. It's actually a form of convergence in some ways. So we create ideas, and then we experiment. We make prototypes. We try them out. And then we generate more ideas. And then we try them out again. And what we end up engaging is a divergent, convergent pulse that's extended over time. This is the road to sustained creative practice. And that's the end game or the upper game of creative development in my mind. Now, next slide, please. Back one. This one right here. Now, we need analytical development. We have a lot of this in regular education. Now, this is a painting of mine. This is a portrait of a cloud I did last summer, and I love using this for presentations because I use this as an example of my research. I had to spend many hours sitting on my chaise lounge on my back deck last summer, studying clouds over and over again and researching clouds to come up with this one. I love research, and you can see why. all kidding aside, after you generate possibilities and alternatives and experiment with prototypes, you have to have an analytical disposition to be able to allow you to assess which alternatives are going to go forward. Now, here's the thing as an educator that I would do. When your students are in this divergent, convergent phase of generating ideas and making prototypes, and they ask you your feedback, I would never give them one alternative as a feedback. Always 2 or 3. I would always give them 3 options or more, so they have to engage in analytical processes, weigh and balancing the alternatives that they've generated, and then which one's going to go forward. Now, you have to realize that students are going to be prone to early closure. At any step of the game, they're going to want to shut down and close on their best idea. After a while, they will learn to diverge again. So they have a candidate for a solution, and we want them to diverge again. Now, let's move on to the next slide, which is a difficult one for a lot of people. This is I call this creative sustain or ideational sustain. Now, I think this is a territory that a lot of people haven't experienced, and this causes a lot of problems for many to understand the true fabric of what creativity is all about, okay? So, this is the ability to engage in that longitudinal, generative, experimentational prototyping practice over a long period of time, okay? Not just we're going to create a few options and pick the best one. This has a time element to it that really gets you into a long-term hybridization of ideas, long-term fueling, long-term idea generation and prototyping that really leads into incredible spaces where students have never been. And this is really important to understanding the fabric of creativity. One more slide. Next slide. Now, just to revisit, you can see this, how I frame creative development. Human nature, intuitive adaptive creativity. There's the 7 creative development strands. And through a systematic understanding and learning experience design, we can enhance creative development and enable students to grow their creative confidence, their creative capacity, and ultimately their creative maturity to engage at higher levels of sustained creativity where they're able to engage in long-term periods of idea generation, experimentation over time. Next slide, please. Now, here's a formula that I think you might find useful. This is a template I developed with a friend of mine, Ian Prinsley, who's from the theater community, years ago. Now, this is a template for assessing educational environments for their sustained creativity potential. Remember, that was at the top of that dynamic flow of creative development. So it's very simple. I take time as a factor. If you devote no time to creative practice in an educational setting, guess what? The whole thing equals 0, right? That makes sense, doesn't it? Now, I take in brackets, I have the creative development factors, and I would apply this to the learner and the educator. Now, here's the key. My belief is this, and we can discuss this in a minute. I believe the creative development of the educator has to be greater than the creative development of the learner. If you're going to enable an environment of creative development. And that's why I focus my attention on teacher education, on advancing the creative capacity and the creative development of educators so they can go back into educational environments and enable students and all those around. So creative development of the educator and learner plus environmental factors that will mitigate and enhance this equals sustained creativity potential. This is a loose mathematical construct. It's meant to be a template that you can use for this. Skip the art piece slide and go to the very final slide. Now, let's just go into, we're at 10:36 right now. I've talked enough. I'd love to hear some of your questions, get a dialogue going here. Here's the actual book itself, Educating for Creativity, a Global Conversation, that has all this stuff in it, plus contributions from over 20 schools from around the world. My contact's at the bottom, by the way, rkelley@ucalgary.ca. And anybody listening, please email me if you have a question or if you want to get involved in further dialogue. I'm always up for that. That would be a lot of fun. And my website's there as well. Or if you want to buy that Raven painting. No, I'm just joking. That's staying in my house. Now, and these are the usual places where this book's available: Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and bulk sales for anybody interested. Now, Wendy, can we maybe go to some questions? People have questions.
That would be great. Thank you very much for this. We have a very buzzing chat box going on. Some of the questions that I'm seeing relate back to sort of the challenges of creating this kind of culture. You know, many folks are working within systems where teaching to the test is a priority. They have resistant superintendents, principals, supervisors. How do you recommend that you trigger this kind of thinking and design for this kind of culture?
Well, I would fire all those people. No, I'm just joking. If you read Mintzberg's stuff, he says the only way you can change professional culture is by changing the people in it. But having said that we can't do that, now we deal with some people. Here's the issue with creativity and education. I rarely meet people who are opposed to this, right? I call it the bobblehead syndrome. A lot of people will nod their head and go, oh, yeah, we need creativity. We love creativity. We're all about creativity. Usually they understand it from the perspective of consumers. So they'll consume creative products. Hey, I just bought an iPad mini a couple weeks ago, and I love it. It's a really neat piece of technology. And people recognize, and business and industry have recognized this long ago, that, hey, creativity in that realm means a product demand, marketing demand, and enhanced profitability and economic well-being, right? There's other reasons for creating, by the way. How about social innovation and for pure artistic expression that are all valid? So we have a culture that maybe understands creativity from a consumption perspective, and that's a big problem. So now, how do we deal with that? And then this is rampant with administrators, with teachers on staff who won't buy in or don't understand it. And if you look at that arrow graphic that we had at the beginning, you can see that a lot of those socialized behaviors that we have are counterintuitive to a culture of creativity or educational practice focused around creativity, right? So here's what to do. I mean, here's one strategy. Number one, if you're in a school, let's say you're the person in the school, and there's only one or two of you that are really interested in this, you're always working in the underground, right? I think the idea of starting an adhocracy, a small cluster of like-minded people within a larger organization that share similar values, where you would find a person teaching another grade or with you, where you could collaborate with them to experiment with some of these new things, and be able to demonstrate them educationally. Because think about this, too. One thing that an administrator will never frown upon is a happy student, is a happy, engaged student. And when you have somebody who's emotionally connected to the work that they're doing, who's experimenting, who's not afraid to take risks, who's not afraid to fail because they know they won't be punished or whatever, I think that's money in the bank for most educators, even those that don't understand creative practice, right? The other thing, too, about this is this. Creativity, understanding creativity from a first-hand perspective, is not easy by reading books or listening to TED Talks. We can get inspired by all that stuff, right? We get inspired, but to understand creative practice, you have to engage in first-hand creative practice. I don't really see any other way around it, which is why that whole graduate program, that 4-course program I run at University of Calgary, is all around creating original work. All 4 courses, from the introduction to creativity and communication, to design thinking across the disciplines, to designing education for creativity, the students do nothing but create original work. And they have an overarching year project where they have to create an original piece of work that's not about their teaching. At first, it drives them crazy. But, hey, I have 5 students that just written books that they never imagined they would do. Some started businesses and whatever. But what I want to do is give them a first-hand view of what creative practice is. So the usual things: visit schools that are successful, focus on, I know this isn't, it's a really broad question because dealing with a principal versus dealing with a superintendent versus dealing with a colleague are all very different contexts. But my thing would be to demonstrate its success. Demonstrate success through the well-being of the student. And I think that's a starting point as well. And the other thing, too, this happens at several levels. So in order to convert or transform educational culture, one focal point should be teacher education. One should be enhancing pedagogy to enable learning and teaching creatively, but also the space identified as learning and teaching to create. Another one would be to bring into your learning environment a vocabulary, a common vocabulary, an understanding of creative development that everybody could understand, that's not intimidating. That's a really important step. And then bit by bit, it's like the invasion of the body snatchers, just keep reeling people in, create the energy, because believe me, this will create a lot of energy in any school, and that will attract positive notoriety and will attract more energy.
You sort of are touching on one of the, there's a host of other questions around this pre-service teacher training. And how do you get into schools of ed, and or are there workshops that you have created that work with these pre-service teachers, and what might be some of the elements of that workshop?
Well, the very, very first thing, that's a good question, because I've done those kinds of things for years and developed them. Hey, and some not very successful. Hey, I was prototyping, and some of those prototypes didn't work. But I'm happy to live what I talk about. So the stuff that I'm doing now is born out of experimentation and prototyping, right? Very first thing that happens, I talked about under collaboration, you have people that come in with high anxiety levels. Because they're used to outcomes known. They're used to very concrete structure, right, and working within that structure. The very first thing I have to do is build trust and build that whole collaborative environment, and it is not easy, because anxiety in a group of educators will backlash on you, or with anybody. So I really think that the other thing, too, is I often find in the early stages in these courses, sadly, people will define themselves by their deficits. It's really interesting. Or they'll apologize. Isn't that something? Going around the circle for the very first day, and somebody introduces themselves with an apology, or by something they're not good at. I find that very sad, this rampant invalidation. So the very first thing is we want to bring them into becoming more introspective, start mining their positive attributes, and I usually do that through metaphor, through a study of metaphor, and through the creation of personal metaphor, and the validation of that. And that becomes a way of mining my own history or personal histories that will become fuel for later creative explorations. So that's a very first step. Growing the collaborative environment, creating a statusless environment, creating an element of trust, removing that penchant for privacy, creating an environment where people are free to share ideas, and creating an environment where people are safe to fail, where an F+ is a good grade, not a bad grade. Those are a few little tidbits.
Do you have any suggestions on how we might approach schools of education? Oh,
hey, I think the best way to do that is to grow something and have people see models that exist already. You know, because you have to realize too, when you can't assume when you're talking to somebody that they understand the nature of the beast. Even though they might embrace it, they might not say this is a good thing. They might not understand the fabric of creative production, the fabric of first-hand creative practice. They understand it from reading and from all that, and they understand it's a good thing, but you can never assume that there's an innate understanding of your clientele, whether it's government or teachers or parents or whoever you're talking to, whatever your audience is, right? So I think the key is to develop models, to develop things that work through research, develop examples that work. Here's a way of doing this. Here's a way of doing this, and here are some of the outcomes, and here are some of the people that are coming out of this situation, and here's how they're applying it in their actual teaching. And you can develop some really interesting longitudinal studies over that for people that are into that kind of stuff. So I think the key is to enable research, enable labs that within faculties of education that will enable these kinds of programs to emerge. And also for school jurisdictions to enable experimentation outside of traditional realms. And I mean some much more open experimentation beyond charter schools and that kind of thing to demonstrate. So people aren't afraid of this, aren't afraid of something different. Change does not come easy for a lot of people. Even change that they think is a good idea. Yeah, I like the idea, but they're not sure how to go about it.
Well, one of the concerns is that, yes, indeed, it's hard to change this focus on assessment and with this idea around creativity. And so people are asking a question in terms of, and it is hard to define what original is or what is creativity. So do you have any thoughts on how one might assess creativity?
Well, let's go to the word original first, okay? There's two ways to approach the word original. In the literature, it's looked at, Guilford, an outcome of mathematical low probability. The word remote is used often. So if somebody produces something that's remote from what they've done before, or compared to the field. Well, number one, in education, let's get rid of large C creativity. I think that's a waste of time, to be honest with you, where I'm comparing students, young students, to what's happened in the field. Even comparing their creative outcome to their peers, I think, to me, is barking up the wrong tree. And I agree with Elaine Starko. Originality should be relative to the person's previous production. Whether it's a person in grade 1 or grade 10 or a university student, should be relative to their previous production. Now, as you get up, you're older, you're an adult, then you're in the field comparing yourself to the top people in the field. It's a different thing. But for creative development, I think you should be always looking at work that's original, work that's novel or a few degrees away of remoteness from previous work. And as an educator, I have a student for a whole year, I can see this stuff. This is an observable phenomenon, right? This is documentable, I think. You know what I mean? By that, so when it comes to assessing now, the whole assessment piece, I just finished the last course in my cohort called Designing Education for Creativity, and we did a major piece on assessing creative development. And it's interesting they're all teachers, by the way, what they come up with. And really the critical mass of this has to be dialogic, because a teacher, an educator in this context, is basically a conceptual coach. You're coaching a student along. You are a co-fueler with them. You're you're nurturing creative development and the divergence and convergence that they're engaging in over a long period of time. So the assessment regimens that you bring along have to be nurturing, have to be supporting growth, as opposed to be one of those factors on that first graphic with all the arrows pointing in the middle. Vertical comparisons, all those things that will be counterintuitive to creative development. So here's so I think number one is you're definitely looking at the formative realm, and you're looking at very dialogic, intense assessment. And you know what? Somebody they want it rooted in numeracy or numerical outcomes. I'm sorry, but that's counterintuitive to this. It's just, if it's not written in a vertical number comparison, it doesn't exist. Well, I'm sorry, in creative development, you can take those 7 strands, you can develop observable sort of growth sort of benchmarks. How about somebody's capacity to generate ideas? That's observable. You can see that. You can see a student who would struggle generating alternatives, or a student who would struggle or who would do very well at prototyping. And a student who maybe how they engage in sustain, or their analytical competency or whatever. Those things are observable, but the goal here is to grow their creative practice, is to nurture the thread that they're on. So I think in this case, a formative dialogic assessment, and I use cooperative reflective assessment. I co-assess these things with my students. I still have to straddle a university grade point average, but it goes in the background. My students rarely talk about it. We talk about their work. So the conversation goes to the work. If we look after the work, the grade looks after itself, and it goes into the background. So I try to move their focus from summative to formative and to dialogic. And that's where we get the real coaching going on and really move their work forward into a higher realm where they never thought they could go. And so that's my general sort of take on it. Dialogic, formative assessment, and I use cooperative reflective assessment where we co-generate key developmental questions that are observable, and the student's very aware of what they're going. So I'm plussing them. I'm really plussing them. And they know where they are and where they have to work. Now, another thing, too, is by being aware of those 7 strands, I can tailor a learning experience design to really enable that student to develop in areas maybe where they need more practice or more growth. Collaborative development, research investigative development. So now I can differentiate, and this is really critical to be able to differentiate, because this is not a one-size-fits-all. Homogenization is for milk, not for people. And even that's questionable, too. So, next question.
Okay. Well, I think people were interested in some just very specific examples, making this practical, and we appreciate that you've been doing it along the way, but you've also sort of dropped some interesting concepts, and we would like a little more detail on, for example, how do you assign idea generation? What are some of the examples?
Oh, good question. So here's the thing. If you have a class of students that they're going to resist this, right? I'll give you an example. I taught a 500-level painting class a couple years ago. They showed up the first day of class with all their canvases stretched in their rectangular canvases. And you know what? Want to know something? This was fourth-year university. Not one of them had previously done an original piece. And I found that hard to believe. I said, show me your original work, some of the work that you've conceptualized, that you've done. All of it was the result of assignments, you know? So I said, here's what I want you to do. I want you to generate for next week 75 thumbnail sketches. This is a university class, mind you, fourth year. And they blew a fuse. What do you mean, 75? I said, yes, just ideas, different concepts of ideas that may become painting material later down the road, subject matter, right? And they backlashed up. I said 75. I said, okay, 100. Let's do 100 then. So we did. They showed up next week, and they had all these thumbnail sketches and pictures and stuff like that. And I know what they wanted to do. They wanted to pick their best one and make a painting off of it. But that wasn't my game, right? Because remember, early closure is always at play. Always at play, right? So when it comes to idea generation, I assign it. I'll assign it. Now, that's an egregious number, 100, but I had a senior class, right? And I expected a lot of them. So they ended up doing 75 more. Hey, my teachers in an undergraduate creativity course, I use John Sweeney's 600 rule. They have to generate 600 ideas first before they get into their task. So I practice. The opposite of early closure is deferred outcome. So if they haven't learned it, I assign it. I absolutely assign it. And I'll ask them to do, so here's the early closure rate here on this graphic, right? So let's say I have my students and they'll resist. You want them to explore. You want them to generate ideas, but they've got their idea and they're not willing to move off of it, right? I have them generate a young class 10 alternatives, okay? And then we plus them. Then we go into speed dating and we plus them. And I give them a goal, and I'll award them mark-wise because they understand that. Extrinsic motivation. That's the culture they come from, right? So I'll use their existing culture to reward the behavior that will get me into the culture of creativity. So moving them from not wanting to generate from early closure into a highly generative disposition, I have to strong arm it at the beginning and structure it really concretely until I move them over that. Now, once they get into that field, they reap the benefits of having deferred outcome because they have way more choices, and they end up with a higher level of sophistication in their creative exploration. And once they learn to trust the process, they go with it. But it's a culture that you build in your class longitudinally, right? But you might have to be didactic or very forthright about it at the onset because you are managing a cultural interface here. And a lot of between the two is counterintuitive.
Well, that's fabulous. Thank you, Robert, for all this detail and insight. Certainly got us all thinking. And there are a series of questions that we didn't get to, and I will ask Robert to look at the chat box after the seminar's over, and perhaps he might be able to answer some of those via email with you later. That's the end of our time for questions. I'm going to hand it back to George.
Thank you, Wendy, for being a great moderator as always. And Robert, thank you for getting so much information into this hour's webinar. I really appreciate your time and knowledge and your commitment to the National Creativity Network. Well, for those of you listening in, we hope you've enjoyed today's presentation and will join us for future webinars. I hope you'll allow me to pause here to thank our programming committee co-chair, Haley Simon, who has taken on the task of identifying and securing our speakers for the series. Our lineup is so exciting, so mark your calendars for the third Thursday of every month. Our sessions are now April 18th and May 16th. Same time and same place. And remember, if you'd like to learn more about the National Creativity Network, there are many ways you could get involved. You could join the membership task force, you could join the programming or fundraising committees, or you could help us with web development. But stay connected, because you can be connected to our efforts or get your questions answered by reaching out to our new executive director, Dennis Cheek, at ststoday@gmail.com. And remember to like us on Facebook and follow us on our Twitter account, which is @NCreativityN.